Welcome to another episode from EduExcel. This is a continuation of the series on Lala Lajpat Rai's views on education for nation building. Lala Lajpat Rai was deeply committed to the state's duty in providing education, making this belief clear in his writings and speeches. Universal popular education must be provided by the state and should be the first charge on states' revenues. Any attempt to provide for nationwide education by private agencies and private funds is futile, and to attempt it is to attempt the impossible. Moreover, it diverts public attention from the duty of the state. A national system of education must be provided for, enforced, financed, and controlled by the nation, and in performing that function, the nation must be represented by the state. In the next few slides, we will discuss in details what Lala Lajpat Rai said about the center and state's responsibilities on education. Education, the responsibility of state. The duty of state did not end with the elementary education. Rather, education at all levels must be provided for, enforced, financed, and controlled by the state, and in performing that function, the state must be represented by the nation. The economic and industrial efficiency of the nation too depended upon the technical and industrial education provided for by the state. In all civilized societies, he found that the education was the responsibility of the state. But above all, what most impressed him was the example of the USA, where the responsibility was assumed by the government for the education of every child born in the country, male or female, and it firmly held that national expenditure on education was even more necessary than that on the army and the navy. His experience of the British standard educational policy in India convinced him that no education provided by a foreign bureaucracy could be for the benefit of the country over which they ruled, because they first looked to their own interests, and even when they established educational institutions, they did so to strengthen themselves. He felt vindicated by many policy pronouncements by British statesmen. Even Montague and Chelmsford too had indicated in their report of 1919 the, the same basic defects in education to which he had been drawing attention ever since his public career. According to the report, one of the greatest obstacles to India's political development lay not only in the lack of education among its people taken as a whole, but also in the uneven distribution of revenues for promotion of education. The report subjected the educational policy of government to scathing criticism from many angles. Pointing to the shortcomings of the government institutions, the report noted they turned out young men qualified for clerks, while the real interest of the country demanded doctors and engineers in excess of the existing supply. The system had also failed to train Indians for practical work in manufacturers, commerce, and the application of science to industrial life. What was needed as the remedial measure was not only improvement of teaching, but also the transfer of the direction and control of the entire system of education to the Indian hands. Lajpat Rai enjoined it to be the duty of the government to provide free and wholesome education to every child at public cost, and wanted it to be compulsory up to the age of 18. The aim of education was to fit children into the life of the community. For this purpose, every type of cooperative method must be used in schools, as they were the places where the children began to learn group initiatives, group responsibility, and social functioning. Every child must be shown his place in life, taught to think and to act, and not to repeat from memory the thoughts of others. To let this be, there should be no compulsion on them to pass through the stages through which other nations of Europe and America had passed, and make the same mistakes involving waste human energy and power. Lajpat Rai's Unhappy India was one of his major works in which he dealt the issue of education in as much as in 6 chapters to counter the contentions of Catherine Mayo, who had made slanderous and wild allegations about Indians. While refusing her vituperative attack point to point, Lajpat Rai added his own comments. The chapter entitled The Light Through the Ages he wrote in response to Mayo's Give me office or give me death. Herein she had laid the whole blame for the educational backwardness of India on the Hindus and the Brahmins. She had charged them with preventing other classes from obtaining access to study and education. As against them, she gave credit to the British government for having made education accessible to all castes, communities, and people. She also blamed the Indians for their lack of interest in universal education. She also charged those among the Indians who were interested to link education with the jobs. This was the rationale of their title, Give Me Office or Give Me Death. Refuting her charges, Lajpat Rai argued that it were the British who merited most of the blame for keeping their countrymen illiterate. What fault and disabilities alluded to were getting aggravated as a result of pursuing a defective policy of education by them. He presented authoritative first-hand evidence to show that a widespread, popular, and indigenous ancient system prevailed in India before the British government assumed of control of education in India. In support, he quoted the statements of F.E.K., Littner, Ludlow, and A.P. Howell. Tracing the Brahminical system of education to the very remotest part, Kay had remarked that it was not in any way inferior to the education of Europe before the revival of learning. The Buddhist system had flourished there was also very much like the Brahminical system from which it borrowed massively and had its schools scattered all over the country. In these institutions, popular elementary education had flourished side by side with higher Sanskrit learning. The Shudras too had developed their own system of instructions and training for the young craftsmen. Speaking on the education of women, Littner made very illuminating observations. Punjabi woman had not only been always more or less educating herself, she had also been an educator of others. The wives of Maulvis and Bhais were generally taught by their husbands, and they in turn instructed their children up to a certain age in reading and religious duties. Littner underlined that the British occupation of India was actually followed by a decline in women's education. Ludlow, in his British India, pointed out that in every Hindu village which had retained anything of its pristine form of rudiments of knowledge were sought to be imparted. A.P. Howell, in fact, acknowledged the existence of indigenous schools in India from time immemorial. On the basis of the testimony of foreign scholars, Lajpat Rai maintained that right from the earliest times there was a well organized and widespread system of education prevalent throughout India. This was a twofold system, one for the aristocratic, cultured, and priestly classes aiming at religious learning and culture, and the other one for trading and working class aiming at economic efficiency and dexterity in the use of tools. As a part of India's village system, this had lasted as a living organization till the British occupation of this country, who, seeing it as a part of the body politic, uprooted it to create a class of subordinate officials and hirelings. There was thus enough evidence to prove that it were the British who destroyed India's old system of education deliberately in order to attract the Hindu people to their fold, claiming to ensure the safety of their positions but actually enhancing their own value in their eyes. Their real aim was to form out of them class of interpreters, a class of persons, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, opinions, morals, and intellect. In fact, they wanted natives on diminished salaries to reduce expenditure. In their policy of education, there was no scope of any industrial scheme. Rather, the British had destroyed Indian industry. Agricultural institutions which they established had begun to produce graduates, but they had very little practical knowledge. This left no alternative with the young graduated Indians except to depend on clerical jobs under the bureaucracy. Drawing heavily on the results of the worldwide investigation made by A. Caswell Ellis of the University of Texas, Lajpat Rai underlined the importance of education in countries' overall development. In case of Germany, Caswell pointed out that the concrete evidence on the effect of education in increasing industrial efficiency was overwhelming. Admittedly, there was ample evidence to prove that natural resources were worthless without education. He blamed the British Indian government for their refusal to recognize that the grinding poverty of the Indian people was mostly due to their ignorance and illiteracy, for which they themselves were wholly responsible. Instead of telling people about the money value of education as the United States of government was doing, the high officials of the government of India were constantly bemoaning the tendency of the people of India to judge the value of education by its material returns. The difference between the national government and a foreign government of exploiters imposed from without was amply illustrated by the allocation of meager funds for education in India in comparison to the amount spent on education of their own people. They spent 25 rupees per head on the Europeans, whereas on the Indian population the amount spent was niggardly 4 annas per head. It was unthinkable, he remarked, for any national government to ever treat education so shabbily as the government of India had done and was doing. According to Lajpat Rai, if education was mainly the business of the state, adequate education by the state was the right of the masses. The state was duty bound to make provision for the elementary, technical, industrial, as well as higher education of the people. No doubt private agencies in India had also a valuable role to play for the spread of education, both literary and higher technical education. G.N. Tata's Bangalore Science Institute, the Bose Institute, the Calcutta Technological Institute, the National Medical College, and the Hindu University Benares, according to him, were given some of the glowing examples for which the credit had to be given to the Indian private enterprise. However, without trying to dilute the achievement of Indian enterprise towards imparting education, the reform of 1919 had transferred the subject of education under the Indian ministers. Catherine Mayo had laid the blame on the latter for the neglect of education. Lajpat Rai argued that Miss Mayo had failed to see that the Indian ministers were not quite free agents as they were under the Anglo-Indian bureaucracy, nor were they free masters in respect of distribution of revenues, for neither the representatives of the people nor the ministers had any control over them. Being the exclusive reserve of the foreign autocratic executive, the minister's chief difficulty consisted in finding finances for education, and the absence of that rendered them helpless. Lajpat Rai highlighted the efforts made by the Indian legislators to make primary education compulsory. The first bill for their reform was introduced by Gokhale in 1911. The government opposed the bill on the usual plea that time had not yet arrived for such a measure and that funds were not available. Another reason given was that the masses were opposed to compulsion on religious grounds. In 1960, V.G. Patel made another attempt in the Bombay Provincial Council, but the bill was thrown out of by the official majority. The pretext chosen then was that the passage of such a bill would be a violation of the educational policy of the imperial government. For the latter declared in 1913 that time for such compulsory legislations in primary education had not yet arrived. These instances confirmed as to how the government felt reluctant to educate the Indians. Catherine Mayo had said that village education was dependent on the availability of women teachers, but women teachers could not venture out for fear of molestation. This factor for her was the chief cause of the widespread illiteracy in India. Refuting this charge as a canard, Lajpat Rai asserted that in sex mortality, the average Indian villager was infinitely firmer, stronger, and nobler than his counterpart in Europe and America. This conclusion of his was based on the experience he had of nearly half of the inhabited world. The real solid reason for the paucity of women teachers, he noted, was that in India there were few spinsters, and since the male teachers were underpaid, they felt reluctant to go to the villages. 1 month's wage of the village teacher was not enough even to buy a copy of Mother India. He said, "You cannot get $20 worth of competence if you pay only $2 a month." The chief objective of education was to raise the nation's intelligence, to improve their physique and augment the earning capacity of her. It was imperative that education should be pushed and furthered by all means. He asked if it was legitimate to raise money by loans for railways and for defense and for contribution to the Imperial War Fund, why was it not legitimate to raise funds for national education? The state should do these things even by incurring obligations in the nature of public debts. If the current finances did not suffice to promote the cause of universal national literacy on any decent scale, private effort should be enlisted to fill gaps in national education. Based on his deep study of educational structure of England, America, Japan, Germany, and European countries, he emphasized that education was mainly the business of the state. However important and earnest be the private effort, he cautioned it would always fall short and in many areas prove inadequate and utter feeble to meet the educational requirements of a modern nation. In fact, it was the duty of the state to ensure that the citizens did not grow up illiterate and uneducated. Their birthright to receive adequate education was indeed a duty no state could neglect. As we reflect on the immense challenges and opportunities before us, one truth stands clear. Great nations are built on the foundation of collective responsibility. In envisioning a just and prosperous society, we must ask, what role should the state play in shaping our future and securing the well being of all its citizens? Let me just leave you with this thought: a nation's true strength lies not only in the dreams of its people, but in the commitment of its leaders and institutions to serve every individual with integrity and purpose. Thank you for watching this episode. Please like, share, and subscribe.